Well, the answer here is about 75%. It's actually just under that for the last school year. St. Paul Public Schools, 72% of kids qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. Again, about double what we're looking at for the state of Minnesota as a whole. So we do have a challenge, and there are a lot of real consequences for kids living in poverty or close to poverty. And we could talk about a long list of them, but among them is the impacts that it tends to have on achievement scores and various school outcomes. Here's just one example. Here we're looking at third graders, and we're comparing the lower income kids who qualify for free and reduced price lunch to the higher income kids who do not qualify, and how many of those kids or what proportion of those kids meet state reading standards in third grade. So only 48% of lower income compared to almost double that, 84% of the higher income kids. This doesn't mean that we can't do a good job educating low income kids. There's a lot of schools that are making very good progress at educating low income students, but it should motivate us that these a lack of opportunity might have real consequences for kids that we need to help address. So in sort of wrapping up our little section here on the relationship between age and poverty in St. Paul, obviously we have a lot of kids in poverty here, so efforts in part need to target younger people, of course, without ignoring others. And we need to support closing the educational income gap. Oftentimes the educational gaps are talked about in terms of the racial gaps, and those are important as well, but we go a long way actually towards solving those racial gaps if we target the educational income gap as well. So those are some of the implications that kind of follow from the data on age. But let's keep talking, let's keep moving forward here, and let's look at household composition. And what we're meaning by household composition is just, do we have one or two people in the household? Are they roommates? Are they a married couple, family? What does household composition look like here in St. Paul? And maybe most importantly, the tie between household composition and poverty. What do our single parent families look like here in St. Paul? So here I'm going to pose the most controversial question of the day. Single parents can provide just as well for their kids as can two-parent families. So take a minute to discuss among your table, or duke it out, or throw something my way. Single parents can provide just as well for their kids as two-parent families. Okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and advance to the answers on this. Yeah, you're right. It is hard to break up all the good conversation in the room here. So this one's true. Single parents can provide economically stable households as well as a lot of other benefits. Of course, a lot of single parents are great parents and have great households, but it's a little bit of a trick question, because I'm also going to give you credit if you answered false. Meaning because single parents are much more likely to be in poverty. So a little bit of a trick question there, but it is an important issue that sometimes people shy away from when talking about poverty, but it's part of the conversation, so I thought it was important to bring it up here. Here are the poverty rates in St. Paul, specific to our city here, by household type. You can see a couple with no kids has very low poverty rates. Couples with kids, that's a high poverty rate, 17%, but not nearly as high as the two groups there, the male single parents with kids or female single parents with kids. And oftentimes female single parents get talked about the most, but really there's very high poverty rates among single parent households, regardless of whether they're headed by males or females, and there are more and more families just being headed by male single parents. I think in this, good question. She's asking where would a grandparent raising the kids fall on this graph, and I think that would fall in the other household type that we're looking at here, which also combines, a variety of households. But that's an important and growing issue as well. Yeah. So just to give you a picture, we've done some comparisons between St. Paul and Minnesota. In this case, I'm comparing St. Paul to the Twin Cities. And so, earlier we saw that the poverty rates for kids in St. Paul were a lot higher than Minnesota. In this case, I'm comparing us to the Twin Cities. This is for all families with kids. Just what proportion are headed by single parents? And so in St. Paul, 32% of families with kids are headed by a single female compared to 20% for the Twin Cities as a whole. In St. Paul, 10% of all families with kids are headed by a single male compared to 8% of the Twin Cities as a whole. So, a much bigger part of the pie is sort of in those orangish colors in St. Paul. So that, in part at least, explains why the poverty rates are so much higher for kids here in St. Paul, and is part of the issues that we'll be wrestling with as this Opportunity St. Paul initiative rolls forward. So the implications that follow from some of this data, there's sort of a chicken and egg issue with single parent families. That is, do people become single parents because they're faced with economic hardship, or does economic hardship cause single parent families, if you will? So if economic distress causes single parent families, that is, somebody loses a job, there's a lot of stress in the family, and they end up getting divorced, for example, well, then we need to end poverty as a way of supporting those families. And I think that there are some people whose real mission is that they want to, maybe they're not as concerned about poverty, but they're very concerned about the families. And I'm just bringing this up because maybe there's some more allies out there who kind of want to come at things from that angle. On the other hand, if single parenthood causes poverty, maybe you have a well-off family that ended up getting divorced, or one of the spouses dies and the rest of the family sinks into poverty. Well, then we need to support families as a way of ending poverty here in St. Paul. Either way, of course, many single families need help and need that hand up that's been mentioned already. Okay, so a quick review, just in case people were still starting to get hazy. How many people live in poverty in St. Paul? And how much of the population is that? Okay, and that includes? Excellent, very good. I think we're going to leave here equipped with some data. A couple more items to go over. Another one that we can't avoid when we're talking about poverty in St. Paul or elsewhere has to do with race, ethnicity, and immigration. Hasn't been talked about so much yet today, but just at my table alone we had somebody from Zimbabwe and somebody from China, and it's definitely part of the equation here in St. Paul. So St. Paul, this is general background, not this question, and the next couple of slides actually don't have to do with poverty, but just information about St. Paul. So in terms of race and ethnicity and immigration, St. Paul is the most diverse city in Minnesota. Discuss that? Oh, it sounds like maybe people know the answer. It sounded like people, let's take a poll. How many tables said A, that's true? How about B, that's false? Okay, quite divided. It's actually false, surprisingly. And actually, it's kind of surprising that it's not Minneapolis. I heard many people saying Minneapolis, but Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park are really at the top of the list, surprisingly. So the third, St. Paul ranks the third most diverse in terms of race, and then if you want to look at immigration, the fourth. Both have increased. There's been some discussion today about how much St. Paul has changed, and that really has been a big change recently. But the question is, all this growth and diversity in many ways is very good for St. Paul. Over the past decade, if you look at the middle part of this, graph, that's the population change over the past decade in St. Paul. It's basically stayed flat. It fell by 1%. So there's been very little population change for the city of St. Paul. But if you look over on the right side of the graph and you compare, if you only look at the population of color, that has grown 22%, quite a bit. That grew quite a bit in the past decade, whereas the white population actually fell. Again, this has nothing to do with poverty. This is just the population overall for the city. On the left side, when you're looking at the immigrant population versus native-born population, foreign-born meaning immigrant population, that population grew while the U.S.-born population actually fell during the decade. So if not for all this wonderful diversity in St. Paul, it would be a smaller city and less, of course, a much less vibrant city. And there's a lot of talk nationally about the coming age of the majority-minority when persons of color will outnumber non-Hispanic whites. And that's already alive and well here in St. Paul among the kids. About 2/3 of the kids in the city are kids of color. So that's all just some general background about race and ethnicity here in St. Paul. So let's take a look at what that means in terms of how that's linked with poverty. So overall, we know that in the U.S., poverty rates are much higher for persons of color than they are for non-Hispanic whites, 11% compared to 24%. So there's a big disparity there and a big cause for concern. Minnesota, it's often known, we looked at that graph earlier, the poverty rates overall are lower in Minnesota than the U.S., and that holds true for the white population here in Minnesota. Surprisingly, that does not hold true for the populations of color here in Minnesota. The poverty rate is actually higher, 27% compared to 24%. So we have a big disparity, and unfortunately, the poverty rates are higher for both the white population and the population of color here in St. Paul, and that gap between whites and the population of color is even bigger in St. Paul. So there is this link, unfortunately, between race and economic opportunity that we need to work on here in St. Paul as elsewhere. To get a little bit more specific and look at specific groups, you can see that the poverty rate for American Indians here in St. Paul is nearly half of all American Indians in the city are living in poverty. 41% of American Indians, 40% or 39% of Asians, and 29% of Hispanic or the Latino population here in St. Paul. Big discrepancies there, and we do have a big and growing immigrant population here, and the poverty rate, the difference between the foreign-born population and the U.S.-born population is pretty stark as well. So all of these things will need to be kind of in our minds, or we'll have to have some kind of an understanding if we're trying to plot how to address, how to end poverty in St. Paul. All of these things help us understand the picture. I guess the basic implications there, I'm sure there are many, many more, but some of the basic ones that I drew from looking at this data is that services, solutions, all need to be culturally appropriate, and there has to address a lot of different cultures. I think the most recent data that I've heard of, at least from the St. Paul Public Schools, for example, indicates that we have something like 77 different languages spoken in the home of students in the school system. So there's a lot of different cultures to pay attention to. And you know, sometimes when you show a slide like this, somebody might say, well, there's something about the American Indian culture or the African American culture, if you will, that is a hindrance. And I just want to mention, I bring up this whole issue of culture because the research really shows that when you support and reinforce that culture, it's actually a help. It helps in terms of having protective health benefits, and it helps just with self-esteem and helping people take advantage of opportunities that might come before them. So the second bullet there is that efforts to design new policy and other interventions need to be inclusive, and so I'm really happy to see the diverse crowd that we have here today, and that'll need to continue to be a part of this effort.